Previously on The Fallen.
The dead are rising and feeding on the living.
I knew it. I knew something was off. I told you, Olivia. I told you the other day that something was off.
We will be safe if we stay inside. Whatever is going on out there, we will be safe in here.
On the ground! On the ground! Get on fucking ground!
We're here looking for survivors. If you haven't heard, the city has gone sideways and we're trying to find anyone alive to take them to safety.
I'm not leaving. I'm not putting Cal at risk. I promised. I promised my mum.
How could the city fall so quickly? Why was this happening? Questions that she may never get the answer. The trio were standing in the destruction that lay out in front of them. Burnt out cars and buses and trams. Charred bodies scattered all around, and large flames bellowing from smashed shop windows. Thick black plumes of smoke soared into the sky. On the air they could hear the dull growl of the dead, which seemed to be a constant now. Wherever you went in the city, the cacophony of sirens filled your ears, deafening and terrifying, a constant reminder that your attackers were waiting, watching. A large double-decker tour bus had careened into a shop, the burning mass engulfing the entire structure. Bright orange flames performing a tantalizing show, enticing the dead towards them with its crackling words. Like moths, the dead clawed clumsily at the orange tendrils, oblivious their arms were being entangled into the tango of destruction. The streets that snaked off the main thoroughfare had been blocked by makeshift roadblocks comprised of cars and large bins, preventing the hordes of decaying attackers from reaching the street. Large army trucks blocked junctions, their empty shells a reminder that not even the strong could survive the onslaught. Soldiers who had succumbed to the dead wandered mindless and slow, their jaws slacked, chewing the air, the low growl sneaking out of their mouth, guns still hanging loosely in their skeletal hands. Led by Pete, the trio managed to sneak past the undead servicemen and women by hiding behind burnt-out cars, using the husks to shield them from view. Eventually they reached a supermarket, the windows smashed, bodies littering the road outside, policemen, civilians and soldiers all lifeless and still. After trying to cover Cal's eyes, Dani helped him through the broken window, his little feet crunching on the broken glass. He wiped his nose as Dani gestured quietly that he look at her and nowhere else. He watched her intently, watching her scramble through the broken window. As he stared, his eyes never faltering, he was filled with a feeling of adoration, a feeling that he had felt many times before, a feeling that Dani had no idea he had for her. He loved his sister, and loved that she looked after him, but now it felt like it was because she wanted to, and not because she had to, and he noticed. Dani hopped down from the broken glass and stroked his hair, pulling him closer as she looked around the dark, empty store. The shelves were bare, and all stock was missing and scattered on the blood-covered floor. As Pete appeared beside them, his heavy boots crackling on the glass, he sighed as he raised his torch, illuminating the shop. They were finally able to see the whole store and saw that there was nothing left on the shelves. Pete stepped forward, turned and gestured to the siblings to wait as he disappeared down an aisle with his torch bouncing side to side as he walked. Dani led Cal over to one of the tills and lifted him onto the conveyor belt, straightening his t-shirt and brushing bits of glass off his shoulders. She stared at his face and smiled to herself as the small, filthy face of her brother stared back, stained with tears, snot and blood. She spat into the sleeve of her hoodie and began to wipe his face, much to the disgust of Cal, who screwed up his features. Dani chuckled, ruffling his hair, giving him a big tight hug, refusing to let go. Pete made his way along an aisle, either side lined with empty shelves. The odd tin of vegetables lay on their side in the metal structures. As his feet squeaked on the floor, he held his rifle to his eye, keeping watch with every step he took. His breath was low, unlaboured, as fear clung to his nerves, his heart beating fast in his chest. After a few moments he straightened up and lowered his rifle, letting out a sigh of relief as he began to look around the empty shelves, looking for something he could grab. There wasn't much, but he took what he could and slowly wandered back to the siblings. After a few minutes, Pete reappeared with his rifle down by his side, clutching a handful of tins and some mouldy bread. He watched for a moment as he saw Dani and Cal play fighting, and for a second they laughed, forgetting what was happening around him. He felt guilty for interrupting as he spoke. He held up some bread. Thick green mould clung to the crust. He looked at it in disgust, sticking his tongue out as Cal smiled.
This is all I could find. Well, and this, but I'm pretty sure it's off.
Dani grabbed a tin of peaches from Pete, turning to her little brother.
Are you hungry, Cal? Do you want something to eat?
He shook his head and wiped his nose on the dirty sleeve of his jumper.
We should go. We don't want to be outside when it gets dark. The dead will be on us before we know it.
The trio walked over to the opening of the glass and peered through, looking to see if any of the wandering creatures noticed them, but nothing. Pete tossed the bag through the window and scrambled over the broken glass, helping Dani through and then Cal. He picked up the bag, his rifles, and led the siblings down the street to the gardens. As they reached the entrance to the park, Cal looked up at the castle, the massive structure watching over the destruction as if it was surveying, waiting. If only they could live in a castle, Cal thought. They'd be safe for sure. Dani looked up at the dark structure too. Similar thoughts filled her mind as she watched the St. Andrew's flag flutter in the breeze at half-mast position. She sighed as she led her brother through the gate into the dark park as the sun had begun to disappear behind the tall buildings over the old town, which looked over the gardens. The park was lit up by large floodlights, made it like it was daytime, the bright lights removing any of the shadows that the dead could be lurking in. Illuminated in the centre of the light stood a large structure like a small castle. It was constructed from scrap corrugated metal and wooden pallets. A patchwork of junk, the structure took up most of the park. A large chain-link fence stood tall in front of the crude structure, surrounding it, protecting it. On the top of the fence stood rusted barbed wire which ran the length of the fence, preventing anyone from trying to climb over. Taller pieces of corrugated metal stretched above it, covering walkways which snaked around the top length of the structure. Men and women patrolling, armed with rifles, keeping an eye on the surrounding areas. As the three reached a large makeshift gate made of 2 large sheets of rusted iron, there was a thick chain hanging off them. Above the gate was a plank of wood with the words Atlantis scratched into it. Burnt-out cars with large metal pikes sticking out the window were parked around the walls as another form of defence. As the trio reached the gate, they passed a zombie that had impaled itself into one of the pikes, a chubby, balding man wearing a black and red flannel shirt and torn blue jeans, his guttural moans pleading to be released. As they approached, Pete waved at one of the guards who was standing above the gate and gave him a knowing nod, and the gate slowly creaked open, the metal scraping in the dirt, a small trench appearing in the mud. As they entered, a man brandishing a knife bolted past them, nodding and walking to the creature. Dani turned and watched as he plunged a blade into the head of the trapped corpse, and it slumped down on the spike, the body slowly sliding down, leaving a streak of thick, dark blood on the sharp metal. The man struggled and pulled, finally able to dislodge the attacker, throwing the body onto the wet floor with a slap, the lifeless corpse finally at peace. Beyond the gates there seemed to be a whole community living behind the security of the walls. Walkways and smaller buildings littered the grounds, all made up from scraps and wooden pallets and crates. Metal rusted barrels littered the ground at different intervals, bright orange flames crackling from within, giving off heat and the welcoming smell of burning wood. A few people were huddled round the barrels, warming their cold hands over the flames, talking amongst themselves. They paused for a moment, as the trio walked through the gate, but then went back to their hushed conversation. Small stalls had been erected, selling essential supplies from food, medicine to clothes and washing supplies. The people manning them speaking to residents, engaging in transactions, or just organising their stock. Chain-link fences separated the community into different areas, each being guarded by men and women who were dressed like Pete, wearing black jumpsuits and holding similar rifles. They watched the comings and goings of the residents, allowing those who needed to pass through the gates to pass. Smoke from the barrels seemed to hang loosely in the air, giving the whole area an ominous haze. The siblings followed Pete in, holding each other tightly, taking in the new sights and sounds. The dull drone of the dead seemed to be drowned out by the cacophony of talking, dull music and the hustle and bustle of the settlement. As they stepped through the gate, the ground turned from damp grass to a sea of mud, their already sodden feet sinking into the ground. Crude wooden planks had been placed on the mud to act as a walkway, but the ground was so wet and churned up that the mud had engulfed the wood, swallowing it like some sort of gelatinous monster. An older woman wearing a dirty Iron Maiden t-shirt walked past, her curly grey hair tied up into a loose bun. She smiled at the pair and nodded and continued carrying a large metal pot of something sweet. Rough wooden signs acted as signposts directing residents to different quarters of the camp: shopping, residential, training and religious. Pete looked through the residents who had started to gather and seemed to recognize a man through the crowd. He was a larger man, with a scruffy ponytail which stretched the length of his back. He seemed to tower above everyone else, standing out in the crowd. He had a thick, bushy brown beard which went down his chest, reminded Cal of a dirt-covered Santa Claus. He wore a tight black t-shirt, his muscles protruding from underneath, threatening to break the fabric. His tree-trunk arms covered in tattoos and scars. At first Dani felt nervous, until he smiled, a large, tooth-filled grin, and welcomed them. He walked over to Pete and threw his arms around him, squeezing him tightly. Pete returned the hug, patting the man on the back, barely able to get his arms around the massive stature. After their embrace, Pete gestured Dani and Cal forward.
Stevenson, hey! We found some survivors in the flats in Morningside. This is Dani and Cal. So, where's the Sarge?
He's in his office, as usual. Greetings, and welcome to Atlantis. The city in a sea of shit. My name's Carl. You can call me Stevenson. Everyone else does.
Dani nervously took his calloused hand. His grip was tight and his skin was rough. For a moment it reminded her of her father's hands after he'd finished working in the garden. Rough, dirty, but welcoming. She swallowed a large lump in her throat, fighting back the urge to break down and collapse on the wet, filthy floor in a heap. He gave her a large, cheesy grin, showing all of his pearl-white teeth which were hidden behind the forest of hair covering his mouth, peeking out like a snow-covered mountaintop. He removed a cigarette from his pocket. After offering one to Pete, who obliged, nodding, and Dani, who politely refused, he removed the lighter from his pocket, and with a flick of his large thumb, a flame exploded into view, igniting the end of the cigarette. With a large drag, he pointed at the walls, letting out the smoke. The thick wisp disappeared into the air before he continued.
Now, we built this community, and I use that word lightly, shortly after the city went south, as a sort of safe zone to ensure people had somewhere to go. It's a bit run down, but I guess it's home now. That large central building is the main hub. It's like a barracks. It's where Sergeant O'Connell makes all the big decisions and has his residence.
The large building took up a majority of the entrance area. Walkways leading from the roof of the building to the ramparts, guards patrolling. In the centre was a large rickety lookout tower which stretched high into the air, allowing the guards to get a wide view of the surrounding park. The main barracks was made up of corrugated metal, rusted and weathered. 2 large doors had been roughly placed into a hole in the metal, and a plank of wood with the sergeant's name burnt into it in fancy writing. Dull orange light peeked out of the rusted holes and gaps in the metal, a warm and inviting glow. Outside of the doors stood 2 guards holding rifles, glaring at anyone who came close to them. Stevenson took another drag.
We have several smaller buildings where people have started businesses, from shops to a pub, even a doctor. There is a residential quarter, and believe it or not, we even have a church, if you're so inclined. We have a patrol on the gates every night, and one which surrounds the gates to keep everyone safe as possible. Although we don't encourage it, people are allowed to leave. But if you go, don't expect to come back or survive very long out there. We send out scouts and teams on supply runs, or, like this lucky son of a bitch, out to find survivors like your good selves.
He stubbed the cigarette out on a wooden post and the bright orange ember cascaded to the ground like a firework, and he flicked the cigarette away.
We have about 150 people who live here, so there will be a lot of people to keep an eye on you, little mister.
Stevenson led the trio to a small shack on the edge of the central square. A torn red curtain hung loosely over the door, and the smell of stale beer and smoke emanated from within. Haphazardly painted on the rusted metal above the entrance was the word pub. Pete held the curtain aside, gently placing his hand on Dani's back, leading her through the entrance, and following closely was Cal, who held onto Dani's hand tightly. Inside they saw a room filled with 5 large cable drums which acted as tables surrounded by plastic milk crates for chairs. At one of the tables, Dani saw an old man resting his head on the drum, his hand cradling a large brown bottle, gripping it as if it was his last remaining possession. Behind an old rusted grill from a bus converted into a crude bar stood a rotund, balding man with a large handlebar moustache and a stubble-covered chin. He wore a filthy, stained white vest, his bulbous belly spewed over his straining blue jeans. He nodded at Stevenson, who raised 3 fingers and looked at the siblings and asked for a milk for Cal. The group sat at one of the makeshift tables and waited for their beers, which arrived quickly. Dani helped Cal up onto one of the crates and pulled it closer to her, placing her hand around his shoulders, keeping him safe. He drank his milk quickly, then rested his head on her legs and cuddled in, falling asleep. She looked down at her little brother, still and peaceful, and a tear trickled down her face as she stroked his head. She wiped it away as she noticed Pete was staring at her with a look of condolence on his face. She gave a half smile and took a sip from her beer. She was surprised when she placed her hand on the bottle to find it was chilled. The cold condensation from the bottle trickled down her fingers. She took a sip, the glacial beer pouring down her throat, quelling the fire of nervousness and pain momentarily. As the smooth beer settled in her stomach, she turned to Stevenson, placing the bottle back on the table.
How long has this been here? I mean, I knew something was up. We'd heard of this illness going round, but we only saw an emergency broadcast this evening that declared that there was an outbreak. I mean, this has all popped up pretty quick.
The bastard media have a very clever way of only telling people what they need to know. They were told to make out that it just happened. In fact, the outbreak started a few months ago, but people are too blind or too caught up in their own lives to even notice. To begin with, the government were able to contain it, hide it if you will, but slowly people started to notice. People started to notice their family members who were going into the hospital with fevers and bad stomach aches never came out, or if they did, they were in body bags. Questions were being asked, and the government, well, they didn't have answers. They panicked as the death toll rose and rumours of the dead coming back to life began to surface. They backed off, told individual councils to deal with the problem. They refused to deal with the bigger picture. When the number of missing persons reports skyrocketed, it became an epidemic of missing people, of family members pleading with the police, with councils, or with anyone who would listen. But no one did, and it was too late.
It started small. Villages and towns' entire populations succumbing to the dead, and then the cities. Glasgow, Aberdeen, Edinburgh. Every city was reporting sightings of deceased loved ones dying and coming back to life. People getting attacked by their posties or neighbours and dying and, well, you get the idea. As soon as Edinburgh got similar cases, the council panicked and demanded that every infected person was, for want of a better word, disposed of, so they set up treatment centres where they'd treat the individuals. This seemed to contain the outbreak for a short time until someone turned in one of the treatment centres and, well, didn't go so well. To try and prevent a complete outbreak, the council were able to get the infected together and contain them in the underground vaults, in the hopes that no one would go down there, and they'd eventually starve. Well, they kind of forgot to tell one of the tour groups who owned the vaults, and when they decided to go down there to do some maintenance, they sort of released hell, quite literally. This community was set up in preparation for when the city fell, which was 2 days ago officially, so here we are.
So what about this place? How were you able to build this place without people noticing? I mean, it's a big project to hide from people.
Aye, that's exactly the question I asked when we were told to build it. Their response was to tell people it was a treatment centre for whatever the illness was. Therefore, people will not get suspicious.
What about the castle? Surely that would have been a better option. You know, fortified, secure.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But that's just another thing the council fucked up on. When word reached London about what was happening in Scotland, Big Liz told the council to use the castle as an outpost. But for some reason, they took too long, and the dead were able to infiltrate, and it fell quickly. To be honest, the whole of Old Town is overrun. It was basically ground zero, so we only go there if we really need supplies.
What about the rest of the people? Surely there must be more survivors.
Well, the rich and well-to-do were given transports to get out of the city, you know, the ones you mentioned. But the poor and the normal folk, like you and I, we were left to try and survive on our own. I guess some of them tried to go to the countryside and avoid the city. The dual carriageways and motorways were completely blocked up and became an all-you-can-eat buffet for the dead. So by road, there's really no way out of the city. We know a helicopter crashed into the train station as well, destroying the tracks out of the city. So we're pretty much cut off. And now the residents of Edinburgh are eating everything that moves.
Before he could continue talking, the curtain to the pub flew open, and a skinny man stumbled in. He wore a brown jacket, torn and bloodied, and had a large rucksack on his back. He had a straggly, unkept beard, and his long brown hair cascaded onto his face underneath a dirt-covered baseball cap. He threw his bag onto one of the crates and demanded a beer from the barman, who obliged quickly, placing it on the table standing next to Stevenson, almost for protection.
Ah!
Whoa, you alright, mate? What's up?
Everything's fucked.
Yeah, we know, mate. You don't need to tell us that.
No, you don't understand. Everything's fucked. They're not letting MD leave.
What do you mean?
They're not letting anybody leave. They built a fucking wall. With fucking guns and turrets and everything.
Who built a wall? Where?
On the border. They've put up a wall, stopping anybody to cross. You get anywhere near it, they threaten to kill you. There's no way across.
How do you know this?
I've just come from there. I went with my wife and Wayne to try and get out of Scotland to get anywhere else, but no, got turned around, wasn't allowed across, told her to stay here. It's all fucked.
Where are your wife and kids now?
They're dead. Those fucking things got them. Went down to the car. The bastard soldiers of the war seized it. So to walk. That was about a week ago. Made the mistake of walking up the main roads. You can't get moved. There's deed everywhere. They grabbed Jackie. Grabbed her for a car, and Davey and Tommy went to help him. They got them too. Oh, Christ. I'm covering my veins bleed. Jesus.
Pete slammed his hands on the table, making Cal jump, and gestured for Dani to head out the bar. When Pete and the siblings left the pub, the cold air swirled around them, the soft sound crackling from the burning barrels and the smell of burning wood replacing the sickening smell of the stale alcohol, thoughts in their heads of what they had just learnt. Pete paced the ground, his hands on his head, kicking stones and pieces of wood in frustration. Dani looked over at the far wall, the Scott monument looming over the community, keeping watch. The sun had all but set now, the impressive structure silhouetted in the darkness. Dani sighed. Her life had changed so quickly, and now it seemed that there was no way out of this nightmare. The Fallen, an Eerie Earth production. Written and directed by Kieran Begg. Starring Megan Chase as Dani Cunningham, Saxon Davids as Pete Kirkman, Jay Platt as Stevenson, Chris Begg as Kevin. Thanks very much for listening.